I am going to tell you a story now, basically, about doing what seemed to be big data research at the time. But essentially, this is a story of what happens when you meet your big data in real life, and you remember that these are not just cells on spreadsheets, but these are often actually real people with feelings. So in terms of the question that was in the abstract about how we should approach social media data these days, my answer to that is that we should approach it with care. And this again touches on something that Richard said at the start there about notions of kind of feminist notions of ethics of care in social media research. And the way I'm going to frame this is talking about research both within and beyond APIs. So normally we think about big data research, and this is research where we're often very reliant on platform APIs, as I was when I was writing this paper, which I'm going to discuss. But something quite serendipitous happened, which meant that I met someone who I was studying in this network, and this then turned into research that went beyond the normal confines of API research. Okay, so this is like a classic big data digital methods trope, okay? The hairball, well, it's not a hairball, it's very nicely presented, but it's a Gephi network diagram. So when in fact, this was the first paper that I ever had published. It was 3-4 years ago. And I was doing research on climate change, and we had an idea to look at Twitter discussions around the release of the IPCC report in 2013, the United Nations Climate Change Assessment. And we were interested to see what Twitter discussions were going on around this report, around 2 weeks either side. So we set up the tool, put in the search term, collected the data, and it was a fairly familiar method. Now at the time I didn't know anything about these kind of methods. I was on the paper because I was someone who had expertise about climate change and climate change debates. So what happened was a person who'd set all this up and was kind of hoovering up all the data from the API, who was working in another country, very good colleague of mine, Kim Holmberg, would send over some spreadsheets and send over some network diagrams and said, okay, here you go, this is what's happening, and can you kind of tell us what's going on, the interpretation. Which is what I did, and then we were doing this, and it was kind of quite interesting here. So you can see in this diagram, as you might imagine, these nodes are users, Twitter users, and the connections are conversational connections between the users. And this was what he sent me. So he'd sorted them out into communities, all the kind of stuff you're probably familiar with. I won't tell you who these are, apart from the fact this big blue one in the middle is the IPCC's official account, as you might imagine. But there are some other rather large, notable nodes here, and the size of a node is the number of tweets that they had in this period that we looked at. So these are very active users. Now, what I'll tell you about this red node here, I want you to focus on this red node, because this is the important one here, okay? Now, this red node, at the time when I was doing this, I was also doing some work on climate skeptics in the UK and climate skepticism, which I was interested in this. There's a lot of work around American climate skepticism, but I was quite interested in what's in the kind of community, a reasonably small community, I would say, but a community of UK climate skeptics. And this was going on at the same time as this. And I will tell you that this red node here is someone who was, who still is, active online as a climate skeptic. Okay. And this was quite interesting to me because this person was very central and was very active, okay, or very central to this part here, this community. So this was the first paper I've ever been involved in, and I was very happy. This is a very nice looking network diagram. This looks very scientific, and it is very scientific and very official. And I thought, well, this person here, I was going to see him at an event, so I'd made some contacts, and I went to this event in London and arranged to go for a drink with him afterwards, just to see what he thought of the event. So we're in the middle of London and we go to the pub, and I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll take these, I'll print these out on some nice big A3 sheets, very colourful, really beautiful. So I'm going to look. Clive, I'm going to call him Clive, that's not his name. Look, Clive, you were very central in this, you know, what do you think of this? I thought this would be really interesting for him to see his role in this debate. So we have a drink and order some food, and then I roll out this enormous piece of paper and I show it to him. And I do not get the reaction I'm expecting. So I thought he would be quite gratified by this turn of events to see how central it was. In fact, he was disconcerted. In fact, I'd say he was slightly upset by the fact that about this turn of events. Okay, not what I thought he would do. And the reason for that, so he said to me, what are you going to do with this? I said, well, we're going to put it in a paper. We're kind of nearly finished writing it. This is a really important part of the paper. We see networks, we see different parts of, this is kind of a European network down here, there's more Australian people here, and there's, I was saying, you were talking to lots of scientists, and scientists were talking back to you. You were kind of quite central. This is kind of quite a good thing for you. He said, no, I'm not happy about it. What he said, the exact words he said, I'm not happy about this appearing in the paper. And I was like, why? So he said, okay, so my name, this is his name. So when the Gephi diagram, just to rewind, when the Gephi diagram was sent to me, my colleague, Kim, had all the usernames attached, and this is quite a normal thing. You see these diagrams with the usernames attached quite a lot. I didn't think anything of it. This is just like a preset on Gephi, if you like. It's very easy to do. Didn't even occur to me. I hadn't even thought about it. He said, this is going to put a target on my back. I don't want this. I don't want this to appear in the paper. I should say this guy is he's not a politician. He's like a private individual. Okay, so this is kind of, being skeptical about climate change is like a hobby for him. Okay. So we're not talking about a big public figure here. So I have no idea what to do with this information. This was a very unexpected turn of events for me. But this was me, you know, we see these diagrams a lot, but this was me actually presenting this diagram to someone in the diagram, and they did not like it. Sorry, I should have said. So this was very much, so here I was within the APIs, okay? This is a very standard research setting, but as soon as I met one of the nodes and talked to him about it, this was serendipitously, and I hadn't planned it, the research had gone beyond outside. It was still the same research subject, but it had gone beyond the confines of the API into a slightly downtrodden Westminster bar, as it happened. So what happened? So I had to go away and had to think about the data that was in this paper. And as it turned out, and that's the paper on the left, this was actually what appeared in the paper. So I went away and thought about why these names were on. And actually, when I came down to it, we had to think very carefully about what the paper was about, why we were writing the paper, what questions we were asking. Okay, this wasn't the case that, you know, you start off with a huge amount of data that you get from the APIs very quickly. So we had to think very carefully about what was in it. And as it turned out, actually, we did not need the names on the nodes for what we wanted to talk about. We wanted to talk about the communities and where they were from and what different types of users they were. And we talked a little bit as well about their orientation, so whether they were supportive of the IPCC report or not supportive. So we could code them in that way, but having the names on was really surplus to requirements. So it wasn't required, so we took them off. However, I'm pretty certain that if I hadn't have met Clive in the bar, we would have just gone ahead and put the diagram as it was in the paper. And I don't know what the implications of that have been, apart from the fact he would have been unhappy. And I don't know whether it would have caused him significant problems, but this was something that changed in the paper. And I would argue it improved the paper, actually. But this was a serendipitous encounter. Okay, so what does this story mean? So I'm going to say very quickly that I think there's 3 lessons we can draw here very quickly. Firstly, this is quite a familiar lesson, but it's always worth repeating, assumptions are dangerous. So I made an assumption, there was assumptions built into the software, into Gephi, about how diagrams look. And I should say Gephi is like an amazing piece of software, so don't take this as a critique. But there are certain things which people do with Gephi networks and certain ways they're presented which are very familiar, which I think we shouldn't rely on. And we should think about quite carefully. And particularly when the networks are related to actual people, actual social media users, that's really important. There are some things in the literature where I think social media users have been named in ways for reasons that I don't understand and for reasons which I think are dangerous. There's been, you know, in this academic literature, there's been names of Palestinian tweeters in the Gaza crisis a few years ago were printed in like a top 10 league in a academic journal for no reason other than this was kind of an interesting prurient list. And I think I don't need to spell out how potentially dangerous that was for some of the people who were identified, again, within something that was an API piece of research. And I expect if we went to meet some of the people beyond the API in real life, they might have had something to say about their names being published. I should say when we published this, I did have some journalists coming up asking me for names. It was interestingly, you know, the media are very keen to attach names to things. And you see things like this in The Guardian, different websites all the times where they do attach the names, but I think as academic researchers, we need to think very carefully before we do that. The second lesson I want to say is that counting as a method of research is political. Now, this is something that Deborah Stone said many years ago in the policy literature, but this was something that was very clear. So when I talked to Clive in the bar, he had someone with him who was also a climate skeptic, and he was going, "Clive, you're being ridiculous. This is like, you know, you publish stuff on Twitter, you're like an author. You should expect to be cited or expect to be quoted." And that is fine up to a point, but what we were doing was we were doing another step. We were collating these together, we were counting how many times he was tweeting, and then representing this as this very large node in this diagram, which looked very prominent. And that was I would argue, it was a political with a small p choice that was being made. That research method would have some social and political consequences outside of a research community. Again, I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong, but this is something to take into account. And the last thing I want to say is about power. Now, the addendum to this story, which is very interesting, is that after I kind of decided to take this person's name off the network diagram, what happened a little bit further down the line, a few months down the line, because I was still kind of, you know, on the same blogs as Clive, and kind of, you know, spoke to him on blogs and on Twitter occasionally. And what I saw him do occasionally was that he actually ended up outing himself a couple of times. So he would say, "Have you seen that paper by Pearce et al.? I was actually one of the nodes on this network." Okay. And when I saw this originally, I thought, this is ridiculous. I went through all this kind of, you know, self-reflection and then took it off, and there's, you know, it was quite a lot of work to think about the paper again. And you've just gone and outed yourself online. So what was all that for? And of course, what is crucial about this was that in the first instance, when I put the name on, I was the one who was holding all the power, and Clive had no power over what was going on with his data. The fact that he wanted to out himself later and say I was in this diagram is totally fine, to my mind, but he was taking back some power as a research subject from me as the researcher. So I think that is important, and he'd got some power of self-determination there. And you know, in standard social research, when you're interviewing people, you expect people to sign consent forms, etc. And that would be fairly normal for those people to have self-determination. They're able to withdraw from the research at any time, you know, all the standard ethical stuff we're aware of. Now, of course, doing social media research at scale presents huge challenges to that. But I think what this story, again, this serendipitous story, does show is that these issues, there may be much bigger challenges, but the issues are still there. Okay, so just to wrap up. And I don't have time to go into this now in the presentation, but just to say, and just to pick up this idea of care again, so how to approach social media data. So if I could sum it up in one phrase, it is to do it with care. And there's a lot, particularly in the STS literature in the last few years, there's been a lot of really great work around care. And a few of you may not be aware of this. So this is from Social Studies of Science journal, Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, who builds on some work from Bruno Latour's kind of quite famous work about matters of concern, and she talks about matters of care. And right at the end of the journal paper, I'm just going to read this out. So she says, the way in which caring matters is not reassuring. It doesn't open the door to a coherent theory or to the comforting feeling that worries about technoscience would be solved, if only we would really care. And I think this bit is really crucial. Care eschews easy categorization. A way of caring over here could kill over there. But it's a transformative ethos, more transformative than just an ethical application, and that we need to ask how to care in each situation. So there's been a lot of competing or a lot of different ethical frameworks for social media research in the last few years, and there's been a lot of struggles about how to deal with it, and those are ongoing. But I think keeping this in mind when we deal with these issues is perhaps the most important way to anchor how we deal with social media data going forward in the future, and hopefully avoid some of these problems that we're getting in the news at the moment, which, to my mind, spring ultimately from a lack of care about the data and a lack of care about what that data actually represents. Thank you very much.